Okay, so you see from that what Adrian Hardiman thinks, right? He thinks this is adjudication that does invade the territory of the courts, or I suppose he thinks this is the kind of thing that if it's to be adjudicated upon, should be adjudicated upon by a court, or certainly by an independent institution, rather than a political and therefore partisan and therefore biased, he uses the phrase biased, institution, namely Parliament, right? And he talks about like the adjudication of past events, particularly on matters which are contested, matters of fact which are contested and which have to do with past events. He says that's adjudicative in its nature. It's not legislative in its nature, right? So I think myself, what you're seeing here, and those chunks just give you a flavor of it, is, a different conception, if you will, a different conception of the legislative power. A different conception of the legislative power. Adrian Hardiman and those in the majority had a very narrow conception of the legislative power. Basically, they were, particularly some of them, particularly I think Hardiman, was inclined to think that the legislative power was just the power to make legislation, and that the Oireachtas could, of course, carry out inquiries, but could only carry out inquiries that were relevant to the exercise of its legislative function specifically. So, I don't know, factual inquiries that will inform, best practice as to, I don't know, this matter upon which the Oireachtas wants to make legislation, right? Whereas Keane had a much broader conception of the legislative function. The function of the Oireachtas, or the legislature, included not just making legislation, but other things too. And in particular, the accountability of relevant public actors, not least the Gardaí. I mean, in fact, Ronan Keane is inclined to suggest like that, if the Gardaí isn't, or the work of the Gardaí or whatever, isn't something about which government should be responsible or answerable or accountable to Dáil, well then what is? So you get that really, really stark disagreement in the case. Now, I would be interested now, actually, after that discussion, we don't have time really, but to do another poll, who are you with, Keane or Hardiman?